we'll start a bit from the beginning, a bit before you got to here.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a bit about, your upbringing.
Yeah.
And also, actually your cultural background.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in Canada, and growing up in Canada, my parents always kept a beautiful garden in the backyard. So we always believed in making food from scratch, using fresh ingredients, and just spending a lot of time around food. We love to eat as a family. So thinking back, the times when my mom used to make me go to the fishmonger or the butcher, I always thought, ew, gross, it smells in there, it felt dirty, but you know what? My parents showed me the importance of fresh food and, buying from local supermarkets or local markets versus the big chains. So that was my childhood upbringing. Fast forward a few years, my teenage years, it's time to decide where to go for uni. I ended up choosing to go into engineering, out of all things. I'd always enjoyed being creative, but, my parents wanted me to take a practical path. So they said, Adria, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or accountant. And engineers seem to be one of the easier routes. So I chose to do that, studied engineering, worked ultimately as an engineer for a bit, but decided that it wasn't for me. So I continued on and worked as a consultant for about 7 years.
When you get to the point of you realize engineering isn't for you, do you have to have that conversation with the parents like, hey,
yeah.
How do they react?
Yeah, I mean, my parents are immigrant parents. They're originally from Hong Kong, China. They moved to Canada in the 70s. And so they came from very little, and they had built this, home for my sister and I, and they had sacrificed so much for us. And so they, in their mind, had a certain way that their children should be raised, the careers they should go into. And so, when I first told them I no longer wanted to be an engineer, they're like, well, that's good, but you better pick something else to do that's, going to give you some stability and, help you build your future. And so going into consulting and finance was, it ticked the box. I had to work long hours. I'm talking like 90 hours a week. I had to travel a lot. Yeah, so it did tick the box. So they were still okay with that when I made that career move.
So consulting and finance.
Yeah.
So that means you're going into my former world, so to speak, in terms of finance.
Yeah, exactly.
That finance world, did you find it rewarding financially, but then not so in terms of like, I won't say spiritually, but probably wore you down doing such late hours?
No, it's exactly what you said. So, there's all the glitz and glam of working in a job like that rewards you financially quite well. You get to travel a lot. I was traveling every week at that time. You meet lots of great people. You get to go out to new restaurants when you take clients, and so it exposed me to this new world of food. Basically, growing up, it was very simple foods that were delicious and fresh. But now in this kind of like finance corporate environment, is going out to really nice restaurants, taking clients out, and so it was definitely a different world for sure. But it wears on you. You're flying, you're eating out late, you're probably drinking more alcohol than you should, and you're spending a lot of time just not for yourself, but doing things for other people.
During that time, was your diet affected? I mean, did you always maintain a rigid diet or healthy eating?
It's a good question. I've always been quite into like wellness and health, so I continue to work out even though traveling. So I'd be that crazy person at midnight in the hotel gym, just like sadly running on a treadmill because I wanted to make sure I got a workout and my body stayed active, because otherwise I'm at a restaurant or I'm sitting at my desk working away on a laptop. I think I became a hunchback after, a few years, but it did wear on my diet and my lifestyle, and it wasn't really healthy. And being on the road, you realize there's not a lot of ways to, you don't always find fresh food, fresh healthy food. You know how it is. I mean, you're working all the time, you're moving around town all the time, like sometimes you just don't know where to go, and then you grab whatever's convenient, whatever's quick.
Yeah.
Or even worse, you don't eat the whole day, and then you have one meal at the end of the day, and it's this big dinner, right? So, it was definitely hard.
So then you get to the point where you now decide to quit.
Yeah.
Then from that time, what's happening over the next few months then?
Yeah, so I was consulting in North America. So I spent a lot of time in Canada as well as in the States. I then moved over to the Middle East for about 4 years. So during then, my husband built a business. I helped him on the side as well, but I was still working in a corporate environment. 7 years, right? So 7 years in that environment, long hours, again, always at a desk, going out in the evenings. I was just tired. And I think partly being a female and a visible minority in the Middle East was particularly difficult. They just don't treat women the same way culturally, not necessarily to any individual's fault, but culturally just, people were often surprised that, I spoke English without an accent. They just assumed, English was my second language because of the color of my skin, which was crazy. And so there's a lot of that going on too, like a lot of like political stuff, and I wanted a change. And by then, like I had the fortunate experience to dine at some pretty incredible restaurants like around the world, and I started getting into like cooking a bit more at home on the weekends, like trying to experiment with my own recipes, and just wanting to do more and more of that. So I decided to quit my job, enroll in culinary school, because I've never had any formal training aside from like cooking alongside with my mom and following basic cookbooks here and there. And so the next step was really go back to getting an education, a second education, really.
And you came to the UK for your culinary school.
So I moved here 4 years ago. I moved here to London to study at Le Cordon Bleu Culinary School, which is just around the corner here in Holborn. So enrolled, I applied. I didn't know if I was going to get in, and luckily I got in, which was great. Wasn't sure what to expect. I had only come to London, as a visitor. I hadn't lived here before. And it was just, from day one, the best experience of my life. Like I just never felt so passionate. Like, don't get me wrong, I like being an engineer. When I was growing up, I played a lot of sports. I like playing sports. There's a lot of things I enjoyed doing. But being in the kitchen every day was just, I couldn't get enough of it. Like I wanted to constantly just be in the kitchen. So as soon as, school was finished, I'd go home, I'd cook for friends, cook for my husband. On the weekends, our tiny little flat became this like hub of like, experimenting with recipes and like mini dinner parties. And we could fit like 4 other people in our flat. But I loved it. I loved having people over. And more than anything, I liked that I was able to understand, I knew what was going in our food. I think a lot of times, I appreciate there's incredible chefs out there and there's so much to learn. But a lot of times when you go out to eat, you don't really know what's in your food. You might have an amazing meal, but surprise, there was, a few hundred, 100 grams of butter in it. Like, you don't know, right? And so I really liked knowing what I would put into it and being able to control that creative process. I found it really, really rewarding comparing to sitting at a desk and just, how it is.
Yeah. So when you're at the school, is that where you amass most of your information about, the types of foods? Where did you get all your information about what people should or shouldn't be put into their body? Because where did that come from?
Yeah, so going to Cordon Bleu was amazing because Cordon Bleu just taught me like all the fundamentals and foundations of cooking. But Cordon Bleu is a French culinary school. So by nature, French food is very indulgent, very luxurious. And so after finishing culinary school, I decided I needed, a bit more education to round off what I'd learned at Cordon Bleu. So it was going back and actually studying nutrition for a bit.
And then from there you studied nutrition.
Yeah.
At what point did was the passion always there to actually set up your own business?
Not necessarily. I actually, when I came out of school, one of the first things I did was to work at a restaurant. So I worked at a restaurant in Soho called White and Brown. So it's an organic chicken and egg restaurant. It's great. It's beautiful. They have a lovely team there. And while working there, I learned a lot about the ins and outs of a restaurant really. But also I realized that in the hospitality industry in particular, it's very challenging because you're working at the times when everyone else is having fun and relaxing. You're not busy when everyone's at work. You're busy when people are off work. So it was learning about that, and I realized as much as I did love, working there, part of the challenge was, having a sustainable lifestyle. And, for a lot of chefs, it is really tough. You do get used to it. You build friends and a community around it. But for a lot of chefs, their daytime is spent, running errands or sleeping, catching up on sleep, and then you're working at night till like 2, 3, 4 in the morning often. So I don't think for me at that time it was just the right lifestyle. So I started thinking about, well, I love cooking. I'm passionate about wellness. What if I start, doing a bit more and combining the two? So I started working on a blog. Just testing recipes, like posting photos and just also trying to connect with Londoners. I'm clearly, I'm not English, so, you know, it was trying to understand the culture here. So putting some recipes, understanding what other people's feedback would be, you know, if I put a certain type of recipe, how do people respond to different food? And started with that, and going from there, it was, well, I really love doing this. I love creating recipes. I love being around food. I love preparing fresh food and talking about it. You know, what if I were to create a restaurant concept or a cafe concept that focused on making healthy eating delicious, fun, and exciting? So kind of started from there, really. And as you know, you run your own business, you know, there has to be a business plan. So the next step was really trying to put together a business plan of what this idea could turn into.
The business plan part of things, how important and key is that? Because many people don't do a business plan.
Yeah.
They don't do like a survival budget. They don't do that. But for you, how key was that?
Critical. I think, you know, doing anything in life, it's not necessarily just, and it's not that I plan everything in my life, but I think if you want to work towards something, you need to be organized. And more than anything, you need to understand what your goal is. Right? And goals can be short goals. It could be, you know, I reset my goals every week. They don't have to be big things. It could be small things like I want to call my mom this week, and you know, FaceTime with her or like Google Hangouts with her. It could be little things like, you know, this week I'm really going to make sure I you know, test a new recipe at home for me and my husband to enjoy. It's little things like that. And setting goals is really important because it gives you also, when you do achieve those goals, it feels great. And if you don't achieve those goals, you can learn from it. You can understand, well, why didn't that happen and why wasn't I able to do it? It's all about like kind of internalizing your own experiences. So I think a business plan is just a fancy word for like goal setting and putting some action steps in place.
Where you're located is on one of the most expensive streets in the UK,
Yeah.
or off one of the most expensive streets in the UK.
Yeah.
How did you go about actually finding the location, and
Yeah.
were you ever like, kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm going in the deep end here?
I don't wish location search on anybody. The two things I don't wish on anybody is probably location search and fundraising. I think those are the two things that are really hard, but you can't do that again until you have a business plan or a goal or direction that you're heading towards. And so when it came to location search, it was looking at over 30 sites across London and working with different agents, you know, going to see appointments whenever the landlord had time. They weren't on my schedule, right? Mm-hmm. I was on their schedule. So, you know, if a landlord said, oh, come see me tomorrow morning at 9:30. Yeah, I'm there 9:30 in the morning. And the site might be right, might not be right. But you have to go there and do your homework. It's, you know, it's numbers as well. So if your business plan is to do X amount of sales, you know, how many people do you need to walk through the door? Then you go backwards and say, okay, well, if I need Y people to walk through the door, how many people need to be passing along the street for them to even, you know, come in?
So that's the footfall.
It's the footfall, exactly. So it's kind of looking at that. And so you're right, I'm very lucky. Mortimer Street it's incredible. The footfall is astounding, and it's only growing. Like Fitzrovia has become such a cool area. And so when I saw that site, I knew right away that, okay, it had the right footfall. You know, did it have, you know, the right space? Did it have the right bones? Like, could I see a potential in terms of like creating my cafe there? And, you know, it ticked all the boxes, and it took, you know, seeing over 30 sites to finally find a site that ticked all the boxes, including obviously the rent. You know, if I had unlimited money to spend on a site, yeah, you know, it wouldn't be that hard. But again, the reality is I had a plan, I had a budget, and I had to stick to that. So
you said fundraising. That's mainly, some people they struggle with the startup costs of a business. Now, not going into numbers, but how did you approach, you know, looking or acquiring risk capital?
Yeah, so first of all, I think even a step back with that, you know, you have to put skin in the game. People always say that. I think that there are a lot of successful people who are able to raise money without putting in their own funds, but I felt very strongly that, you know, I believed in my idea and I wanted to do this. So I put money into my own business. That was the first step, is putting, you know, skin in the game, if you want to call it. And the only way you can do that too is, again, planning. Like if I hadn't planned, you know, ahead of time to save a bit of money myself, then I wouldn't have any money at this point to then invest in my own business. So I think going into your own business, the first step is, you know, the practical reality is you need to save a bit of money, because when you do your own business, no one's cutting you a paycheck every week. Like, gone are the days of, you know, every week or every other week, whatever it is. So that's the first step, is set yourself up financially, be able to invest a bit into your own business. The second thing is just putting yourself out there. raising money is about sharing your love and passion about something with other people, trying to get them to see what you see. But it's also about putting yourself out there. It's about meeting people who you normally wouldn't meet, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. Like, I met some pretty wacky investors who were very, very out there, lived in, very glamorous homes, had someone doing everything for them. It's just a very different situation than the way I grew up. So yeah, it's putting yourself out there and be ready for people to say no. I had friends who, I'm very lucky. I had friends who supported me in the investment, but I also had friends who were too, I wouldn't say embarrassed, but they didn't really want to talk to me after knowing that they were going to say no when it came to investing a bit. They just didn't want to have that conversation. They wanted to support me, I'm sure, but they weren't ready to say no. So, some of the friends I didn't speak to for months just because they didn't really want to say no. They didn't want to get in touch. And it is quite sad, but at the same time, you have to expect some of that. And you're also going to expect people to tell you that your business isn't going to work. They're going to tell you, well, thanks for telling me, well, that sounds great, but I just don't think it's going to work. So I'm sorry. So you have to also be ready for, putting yourself out there and then being rejected, really.